This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. On today's show, we are continuing our A24 Retrospective. This is our 14th edition of the series. You can listen to episodes 211, A24 Retrospective The Rover, 205, A24 Retrospective Obvious Child, or go all the way back to 108, A History of A24 Films, to get the full backstory of the company. Today we're looking at 2014's Tusk, directed by Kevin Smith. The film stars Justin Long as Wallace, a podcaster who travels to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and decides to interview a former sailor, Howard Howe, played by Michael Parks, who has lured Wallace in hopes of performing a grotesque surgery on him. I want to welcome back to the show Nathan Sizemore. Nathan is one-third of the I Hope You Suffer podcast, where each week Nate, Katie, and Kit review self-described wonderfully terrible horror movies. Nathan was last heard on ContraZoom way back on episode 128, Fright Flicks, where Nathan actually recommended Tusk as his horror comedy pick. Welcome back to the show, Nathan. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me back. I forgot I recommended Tusk in that episode.
And all I remember is just Katie verbally rolling her eyes at your pick.
Yeah, that's common.
I was kind of hoping that she would be able to come on too, because I actually just wanted to listen to the two of you talk about this, and I would have been totally fine sitting in the background giggling the whole time.
Right. It's definitely a movie that I'm very curious for her to watch at some point, because I feel like it's going to go one of two ways, where either she's going to be very into it or absolutely despise it. I don't think there would be a middle ground.
Yeah, I definitely agree after watching it. You're basically going to come away with one of those two feelings. And I think you and probably other people might be a little surprised with how I reacted to it. But I knew when I started this series that I had circled Tusk as the one that I needed to have you on, because you had mentioned it on when you came on the show previously, but also you'll tweet about it every once in a while. Every time you do, it's always that, like, add an extra highlighter layer to you have to make sure Nathan comes on for this show.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I've when we started I Hope You Suffer, Tusk was like on my short list, and for some reason we've just never gotten to it. And then I hit a point where I was like, I'm periodically just going to tweet at Kevin Smith, and I'm just going to be like, I'm not doing Tusk till he accepts coming on the podcast, which is never going to happen. So
That's funny. And I know it's funny because you've told me in the past where you've had people reach out to you, be like, hey, you should cover my movie. And your response is that you're going to be brutally honest whether you like it or not. And they kind of back down from that. So it'd be actually interesting for Kevin Smith to come on, considering how self-deprecating he can be at times, to sort of break down a movie that some people really don't like and some people really, really do like.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'm like, I don't want to say the term apologist, because I don't apologize for, like, I'm a Kevin Smith, like, fan since renting Chasing Amy when I was like 12, and not fully knowing what I had, like, no idea what it really was. And remember, like, I was like, oh, I'm gonna rent this, like, weird comedy, and, like, as a 12-year-old, and then watching Chasing Amy and, like, being like, I don't know what I just watched. Why am I crying? What's happening? Like, and so, like, I generally, I back pretty much all of his movies. Like, I enjoy all of them. I know there's things like Tusk and, like, Yoga Hosers and whatnot where, like, people are pretty against them and whatever. But I've been, like, a fan of his for a long time, listened to all the podcasts and stuff, and I feel like it's one of those things where it's like, the dude is just making the art he wants to make at this point, and I find the backlash against that very interesting, and especially in regards to Tusk, where he's talked about, been like, you know, some people come up and is like, oh, this is so good. And he's like, yeah, isn't it? And then other people come up like, this is the worst movie I've ever seen. He's like, right, isn't it? Like, he knows it's not like, I was going to say he knows it's not a serious movie, but that sounds like shitty. Like, he knows what, like, it's not like a movie that he was like, I'm making this, I'm going for like Oscar bait, kind of like, whatever. Like the premise of the movie is so ridiculous that like you can't make this movie and be like, no, this is a serious movie that people have to take seriously, like The Godfather.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's definitely, it's like a polarizing movie, even like within his fan base, within like the horror fan base. So I'm excited to dive into it.
Always do sober what you do drunk. It'll teach you to keep your mouth shut.
Hemingway said that.
Yes, he did. And he said it to me.
I don't want you to go to Canada tomorrow.
It's for the podcast. It's what I do. I travel around and I interview weird or interesting people.
So look out, you crazy Canucks!
Wandering Wallace takes a raunchy road trip up to the Great White North.
Hello, I'm an old man who has enjoyed a long and storied life at sea. And after eons of oceanic adventure, I know I do not wish to spend my remaining years alone while I have such stories to share.
How far is Bifrost from here?
It's about 2 hours from here.
It's about 2 hours away.
I hate American guys.
Awesome. Okay, so filling in a little bit of backstory here, Tusk is a film written and directed by Kevin Smith, as we just said, the man behind Clerks and the Jay and Silent Bob movies, among others. Back in 2011, Smith pivoted from his traditional sort of laid-back stoner comedies to direct his first horror movie, Red State. Tusk was his follow-up film and second foray into horror. Tusk was also his first in the proposed True North trilogy of horror movies taking place in Canada. Yoga Hosers is the second film in the series, with the announced Moose Jaws as the final installment. The movie is about Wallace, an arrogant podcast host who has a show called The Nazi Party, Notsee, with Haley Joel Osment as his co-host Teddy. They find videos on the internet and make fun of them for comedy purposes. Wallace goes to Winnipeg to interview the Kill Bill Kid, a spoof of Star Wars Kid about a young man who swings around a samurai sword in his garage ungracefully and accidentally cuts his leg off. When he gets to Canada, he finds out that the boy has committed suicide. Not wanting to waste his trip, he finds a personals ad in a bar about an old man who has plenty of stories to tell. Wallace decides to pay a visit to the wheelchair-bound Howard Howe, who drugs him and begins to perform surgery on him to make Wallace a human walrus, tusks and all. The film premiered during the Midnight Madness portion of the 2014 Toronto International Film Festival, where it was named the first runner-up for the People's Choice of that category. The film had its wide release on September 19th, and A24 acquired the film during pre-production after Smith walked away from a Blumhouse Productions deal over a release date strategy and Blumhouse wanting an unknown lead. This is going to be a spoiler-filled episode, so if you have not watched the film, we suggest doing that first. I think the starting off point for our conversation should be the big point that I didn't talk about in the introduction. The movie was based on a podcast episode of Kevin Smith's Smodcast show. On episode 259, The Walrus and the Carpenter, Smith and his co-host, Scott Moiser, read a prank personals ad where a homeowner was offering a living situation free of charge if the lodger agrees to dress as a walrus. They spend the next hour crafting an entire narrative of this setup and in the end announce that they want to make a movie, asking fans to use the hashtag #WalrusYes to show support. So, how does the first movie being based on a podcast episode work for you, Nathan?
So it's no secret that I adore this movie.
Yes.
Like there's some things in it that I could have had taken out of it that we will definitely get to, but like overall this is one of, like, I would say if I did like a top 20 horror movies, this would probably be in it. It's pretty high up on my list, and I'm generally a very big fan of it.
It's funny where we are at now as a society, where I still cringe whenever, people make jokes about podcasting on movies or TV shows, because I get it. Like, what we do is silly. We're talking into microphones and blabbering on about whatever BS we feel like we deserve to have an audience for, sort of thing. But I know back in 2014, it was even more of a curiosity having something as big as a full movie being based on a podcast, and considering podcasts were still new, and having the lead characters be podcasters, where you get all real meta with this sort of stuff. And I can't help but sort of look back and sort of realize that I feel like Smith kind of accurately was portraying that era of podcasts and podcasters in a way that has aged well, in the sense of like, that's really what it was like. There was a lot of these like very douchey, bro-y stuff that sort of has given rise to shows like the Joe Rogan Experience and stuff like that, where that was the prototype of just people making fun of other people basically as comedy.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would not be surprised if there weren't at least 30 podcasts in the world that were basically after this movie came out, stole the idea of, I'm gonna go hear someone's story and then come back and tell my friend about it. Whether it's as like douchey as, you know, Wallace's like version of it, maybe not, but like I don't know, if I find it, no, I guess I can't say I find it hard to believe there's somebody out there that would like be as kind of terrible about it as Wallace, but I'm sure there is.
Yeah, I just remember that like era of comedy, and I just sort of look back and be like, man, I can't believe people found this shit funny then. And I just was in research of this, reading reviews that were coming out at the time, just people's reactions to it. And the biggest criticism seemed to have been about how dare they make a movie about a podcast? How ridiculous is this? You can't take podcasters seriously. And I think that sort of is also the real crux of this entire movie of, don't take this movie that seriously, guys.
No, yeah, there's like it's interesting because it's like, I don't know how you go into a movie where the premise is another guy turns somebody into a walrus and be like, oh, this is going to be like, especially from Kevin Smith of all people, and be like, well, this is going to be like on par with David Cronenberg's The Fly. Like, I should take this seriously as like a high art piece. And it's like, no, like, I feel like from like the opening scene of them doing the podcast, you should immediately be like, okay, this isn't a dead serious horror movie. I should like adjust my expectations of what I think I'm getting.
And I think that sort of goes for pretty much all of Kevin Smith's career, if you really think about it. Like, his comedies, like you were talking about with Chasing Amy, aren't always that funny. They have real emotional core to them that will make you cry and things like that, and has a great eye for satire. And so it shouldn't be that much of a shock that when someone like Kevin Smith pivots from doing comedy that isn't really that funny to horror that isn't that scary, that he's not really going to be playing by the traditional rules anyways. Yeah.
And like, horror and comedy there's a very fine line you have to walk to make a horror comedy work. Like, there's not a lot of horror comedies that I think really nail the balance that you have to have. Like, where some of them are just too heavy into comedy, and some of them are don't lean into the comedy enough. And like, it's a weird mix in Tusk, because like, I absolutely can watch it and be like, okay, it's the same way like how like Kevin Smith said, where he's like, well, like, people say this is great, and I say, yeah, isn't it? And people say this is trash, and I say, isn't it? Like, I absolutely get the people that are like, this sucks, this doesn't work for me. And I think a lot of it has to do with like, a lot of the jokes in Tusk kind of probably only work as well as they do if you're like overly familiar with his podcast work, because so much of it is references from podcast episodes that he's done up to that point. And like, you know, to the all the way down to like Wallace's cell phone ring tone is a clip from like Hollywood Babylon. Like he like overflows Tusk, especially with jokes that are so like podcast episode specific that like if I can't imagine. Well, I don't even have to say I can't imagine. So I saw Tusk in the theater when it came out. I went to like a screening where it was me. I dragged my mom with me for, I don't even know why. I think we were going to do like dinner afterwards. I was like, well, I'm going to go to this movie if you want to go. So she went with me having no idea what she was about to get into. And then there was one other guy in the screening with us who, after it ended, was just like, what the hell was that? And I was just like, yeah, I don't know how to explain this to you, because like the only reason I found any of these jokes funny is I had the reference of listening to all of these podcasts leading up to it and knowing what that joke came from. The cop I can't remember their names now, Haley Joel Osment and Genesis, like go and meet up with, I can't remember their character names, are blanking on me at the moment. Like the cop they meet up with in Canada is Ralph Garman, one of his podcast co-hosts, that in like episode 2 or 3 of the podcast they do together, someone wrote in a letter and accidentally called him Frank Garman instead. So his name plate in the movie is just like Frank Garman. And that's just like a joke that only works if you've listened to that podcast.
Interesting. Yeah. So I approached this movie having never listened to any of Kevin Smith's podcast. So all of this was sort of brand new and fresh for me. And for the most part, I feel like I was on the wavelength of the humor. Obviously, I probably wasn't getting some of the subtle things. I did notice Ralph Garman because I recognize him from the Joe Schmo show when he was on that.
That was such a good show.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah. I did see his nameplate. I'm like, Frank Garman, that's not his name. And I was confused because I was like, I recognize him. I'm like, is his name Frank Garman? Am I forgetting this? And then it wasn't until the credits, and I didn't even point that together until you just said that now, that it was done intentionally. So that's interesting. But for the most part, I think the comedy still worked, even if I don't know the sort of, I'm not a part of the in-group of these jokes. But I'm sure you can have a deeper level of appreciation for the movie if you do know the podcast as intimately as someone like you do. And that sort of raised the question, did Kevin Smith really make this movie for at most a few thousand people?
I mean, yeah, like the thing is, and I think it's a weird, there's a weird reaction people have to Kevin Smith, where for like his first 5 movies through like Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, people would be like, oh, get away from these characters, do something new, like expand yourself. And then when he finally did, everybody was like, why aren't you making Jay and Silent Bob movies anymore? And like, I feel like he has this like, well, you can't even say like fan base, because like so many people just are kind of now, especially with like the prevalence of like Twitter and Facebook or whatever, that are just kind of there to just whatever he does are just going to tell him he sucks at it, you know? It's just the way the internet is. But like he hit this point, I feel like, after around the time he did Red State, and kind of has continued since Red State, where he's just like do you know like the story behind Red State and him kind of like pissing off the critics and like kind of quote unquote burning his career down?
No, I haven't seen Red State. I remember when it came out, it seemed like it was such a weird departure for him. I'm not gonna lie and say I'm a huge Kevin Smith fan. I've seen a bunch of his movies, probably 6 or 7 total. But yeah, I don't really know the story behind Red State, so please feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, so when he made Red State, they made this big thing, like it was his like, you know, like it was his like quote unquote return to like independent cinema, because he, you know, pretty much since Clerks, he's been with Universal, and then was like with Miramax and like whatever, was pretty much constantly working in the studio system, making like his kind of lower budget movies, but still like it was the studio system. He wasn't doing like independent movies. And Red State was like completely, he found the funding for it, all of that stuff, and he made this point of like had this like sort of publicity stunt where he went to like Sundance, I think, and was like, I'm going to auction the movie off to like whoever, and then they'll be able to release it. And then like went and did this auction and was like, I think one of the producers of the movie did the first bid. He was like, sold. Actually, we're releasing the movie ourselves, blah, blah, blah. And like, we're not going to send it to critics first. We're just going to do whatever. And like, kind of like went after the entire like system of promotion in major studio movies, you know, where studios will spend sometimes more than the movie cost to make on just promotion for movies. And Smith was like, I've been doing this for 20 years at this point. And he's like, I know like my movies make roughly $30 million, no matter what the budget is. Like my base comes to these movies. Promoting my movies to another base isn't like, it doesn't work. So like, I don't know why I would make this $5 million movie and then have you spend $10 million to promote it to people who aren't going to come. So let me do like what I'm on. He was like, I'm doing Red State, or I made the movie. I'm not sending it out to critics to review. I'm I'm not gonna just do the typical, here's a bunch of commercials, blah, blah, blah. He's like, I'm going to go out tour it myself. He's like, I'm going to 4-wall it. And that's what he did. And critics like lost their mind. It was like, Kevin Smith has imploded. He's burned his entire career down. They just like, when the movie finally came out, like shit all over it. Despite it, like Red State's another one where it's like Tusk, where like I fully enjoy that movie, but I could also see why people don't enjoy that movie. And it was just like an interesting thing that like he went back to making like independent movies and then kind of was like, I'm making movies for like my base, and if you don't like it, don't watch them. I don't care. Like I'm making the movies I want to make for my fan base, and that's it. Like it's kind of the same way that like, as much as I don't like Rob Zombie's movies, I respect that he found his like niche, and it's like, I'm gonna just keep making the movies the way I want to make them, and if like my base is going to go see them, and they'll probably enjoy them because it's my sensibility every time, and they seem to enjoy that. And like, if you don't, then I don't care. Like, I'm making the art I want to make as best as I can, and then, you know, if it just plays to my base, then so be it. And I kind of respect that of somebody that knows sort of their, I guess, limitation sounds bad, but like, you know, like they know they've hit the reach they're going to make with the art they make. And it's like, yeah, I'm just gonna keep aiming for that instead of being like, I need to get everybody that goes to see the Avengers to come see my weird movie where somebody turns somebody into a walrus. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think that's like a respectable choice for people that especially have been making movies long enough that it's like, I know how the system works, and I know that my ethos and the way I do things doesn't work in that system.
Yeah.
Like
it's
refreshing.
It's refreshing, and it's also kind of frustrating that there is the need to still try to force someone like Kevin Smith into a system. It's like, well, this is the way it's done because this is the way we've always done it, sort of thing. And it very much sort of like, I don't want to compare his style to the rise of streaming services and things like that, but sort of in a different ideology of where like when streaming services first started, and they're just like, what do you mean you can't just have a high profile movie come out on your service? That makes no sense. That's not how it's done. And so I sort of appreciate that, like you're talking about with people like Kevin Smith, people like Rob Zombie, and you know, there's a whole host of people who sort of just do their own thing. Is like, hey, you know, people that like my movies are going to see my movies no matter what. Like,
yeah,
give or take, they'll be there.
It's just like an interesting thing where people get mad at that as if that wasn't like there were so many people that have had 40-year careers based on like, no, I know, like I make straight to DVD or straight to VHS back in the day movies. Like I know my movie's not going to play in a theater, but like I've managed to have a career and live a perfectly comfortable life making these movies that are strictly going to go straight to Tubi or whatever, you know? Like, I don't think there's a shame in that, like, whatsoever, that if you're making, as long as you're making your art the way you are comfortable making that art, absolutely do it. I don't think people have to, I think going back, because especially with this movie dealing with like podcasts, like I feel like there's this weird mindset in the kind of podcast community where I've seen a podcast start up and just try their damnedest that they're like, I'm going to be the next, you know, last podcast on the left of like, you know, I'm going to be the next huge horror podcast. And I'm like, just, you can't, I don't know. It's one of those things where like, I feel bad kind of like going after some people like that, where like, I get it. Like it would have been, you know, I don't think anyone goes into doing whatever their thing is with the idea of like, you know, I think people go into it like, it would be awesome to have this somehow work out where this could be a job that I make a living off of. But it's like, I feel like a lot of people go into things like, especially podcasts, where they're like, I'm going to be the next Joe Rogan. This is going to be so sick. And it's like, I think you need to just go into it with your passion of whatever you're going to discuss, however your plan is, and just hope that it catches on with whatever crowd it catches on, instead of immediately be like, I'm going to try to make this become a $100,000 a year job for me. Cause then it's like, it just kind of like reeks of like, well, you're not super passionate about this. You're just kind of trying to become popular sort of influencer thing. Yeah, no, that's fair. Maybe we should pivot a little bit and start reviewing the movie a little bit. Yeah. I'm going to reveal here, I actually really like this movie. I was not expecting to like this movie, and I found myself on its wavelength and was enjoying it, except for it once the movie goes in a certain direction, which we'll save that for a little bit, but which I'm sure, as your laughter there suggests, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. The actual concept, you know, it sounds a little ridiculous, but, you know, these sort of high-concept movies like this, if you have a committed director doubling as a writer and cast, and they're all on the same page and know what you're working towards, you can really pull something off like this. And I gotta say, I'm super impressed with Justin Long. You know, I think he's a funny guy. I've enjoyed a lot of his other movies, but I've never really seen any sort of real depth from him. In the way that his character starts out, I was sort of expecting a traditional Justin Long performance. And as it went on, and as he's sort of being tortured and, you know, having his legs, you know, sawed off, and then he's slowly being outfitted with this disgusting skin suit that is sewn onto his body, and the transformation is getting more and more grotesque. I felt a real character change with him, and I was super impressed. I've never seen this depth from Justin Long before, and I was like, damn, is Justin Long secretly like one of the best working actors today and just hasn't been given the right parts to show it off? Like, I've been doubting my entire life now of everything I know about this guy. Yeah, I think it's like, I think he got kind of, you know, for a period, just typecast as like the like a funny, cute guy in movies. And like, you know, I can't say I've seen a lot of stuff he's done, but I've seen like a good portion of like the horror stuff he's jumped in. Like, he's pretty good in like Drag Me to Hell, but his role's like not deep as kind of like this one is. Like, he's just sort of like the boyfriend of like the main character in Drag Me to Hell. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a lot of stuff like that, where it's like, I feel like most of the stuff I've really seen him in, he's like a secondary character or like a cameo or something. So yeah, it was the same way where I was like, when I first went into seeing Tusk, I was like, because like at first you're like, oh boy, this guy sucks. And then it's like, once the actual plot kicks into gear, he's so good. Like, the scene with him and Michael Parks when he first wakes up and is missing the leg, he's killing it. Him and Park, Michael Parks, I can't say enough good things about in this movie. And like the two of them like acting off each other in like that scene and the one at like the dinner table are just both so good, of like him just being just absolutely scared and baffled by the entire situation, as Michael Parks is just slowly like revealing himself to just be completely crazy. Is just, yeah, he's just so good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the other component to this movie, because it's basically more or less a two-hander. Then you've got some B story going on as well, but it's really between Justin Long and Michael Parks. And I really only know Michael Parks from his bit parts in like Tarantino movies and stuff like that. I'm not super familiar. I know he has a pretty big career that I'm sure you're more familiar with than I am. But yeah, it basically was just like, let's give an opportunity to a great character actor to just like go truly unhinged, chew the scenery, chew everything around him, and not hold back at all. And I sort of appreciate that they also kind of like slowly turn the temperature up on his craziness too, because like you first meet the two of them together when Wallace goes to Howard's house, and you know when Wallace is like being a dick and like, you know, making fun of his stories and like being his, you know, douchey humor podcast self that he is, and you slowly see Howard just kind of like nodding along and being like, yeah, I appreciate that I have the company here. And then slowly, as he's revealing more and like telling his like sailing stories and all that sort of fun stuff, it sort of like ramps up. You're like, okay, this guy's interesting. And then once we get to like that first like post-cut surgery scene where he's sort of revealing, oh, like, oh, a spider bit your leg, had to amputate you there. That's when like the crazy train's, you know, full on. It's going 500 miles an hour. You can't stop this thing, and all the way up until his big spoiler here, his final scene where he dies when Wallace finally kills him. Just like pure unhinged insanity, and it works because it fits with Kevin Smith's tone of what he's trying to do, and you have Justin Long across from him just being absolutely bewildered the whole time of like, who the hell is this guy and what is he doing to me? So it really works that the two of them can play off each other and hit those highs the way they do.
Yeah, like kind of like go like the one scene specifically I think that works the best is the scene where they're sitting at the dinner table and like Howard's just like eating, having the conversation, and Justin Long is just like kind of like staring at him for a minute, just like in this weird haze, and he's just like, why can't I move my arms? And he's like, oh, like I had to like give you morphine for the pain. He's like, no, you gave me, you just basically you've immobilized me. And, you know, they have the back and forth, and like I forget exactly how it comes up, but all of a sudden, like Howard just starts doing like the creepiest version of Itsy Bitsy Spider.
Oh yeah.
And like Justin Long's just like, what the fuck is happening? It starts like screaming. And this, like, I guess this was like a Michael Parks choice, because like Kevin Smith has talked about, he was like, I wanted him to like get up and run over and like smack him to get him to stop screaming. And Michael Parks was like, no, it needs to be like slow and like creepy. And he like gets up out of the chair, Justin Long just like screaming his head off for help. And he just slowly walks over, slaps him, and then just gives him a point with this like, just like cold face. And I'm just like, there's few things that like horror movies don't fully affect me where people are just like, oh, this was like really scary to me. Like, it's just not how they hit me, especially like anymore. But there's something about like Michael Parks in that moment that I'm like, okay, I believe this dude is like real and is like not fucking around.
Mm-hmm. And I think a key to that scene that you talk about that works so well is because up until that point, we've only seen Howard in a wheelchair.
Oh, yeah.
And they're doing this big interesting scene, and Justin Long is slowly starting to freak out, and then he stands up, and you just sort of, I wasn't expecting, I sort of expected it, because I like, you know, the premise of the movie, you're like, okay, I bet you he's not really in a wheelchair or something like that. You're not too sure how it's all going to play out, and you just sort of see him very slowly stand up, and just the realization on Justin Long's face of, Yeah, it's not morphine. It wasn't a spider that bit me. I am in deep shit here. This guy has lured me in here, tricked me, and all the stuff that's happened, it's only going to get worse from here on out.
Yeah, and it's like kind of to jump on the thing where you said about like Justin Long in this movie and kind of like realizing like how good he is, like a good portion of his stuff in this movie is either reactions to things or completely like dialogue lists because he gets his tongue cut out at a certain point and is just like in a walrus suit. And like, you kind of like, a lot of the time he's in the suit, you like focus in on his eyes, and it's that like acting with your eyes kind of thing where you're just like, I don't know. I'm fully in on like the wavelength that he's pulling off here. And especially in like those two scenes too, that's like him and Parks just going back and forth. Like you see it in his face that like he's like, it almost feels like real, like that he's legitimately like, oh wait, is like he falls into that scene where he's just like, oh, this dude's legitimately terrifying me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I sort of mentioned before that the movie mostly works for me, and there is one character in particular that the second he comes on screen just completely kills the momentum. You've got a surprise Johnny Depp performance where he is not credited by name. He is only credited by his character's name, which is Steve LaPlante.
It's Guy Lapointe.
Guy Lapointe, sorry, yeah, wow, Steve LaPlante. That was a different movie I actually just reviewed where that was a real actor's name in it. Very, very sorry there. Yeah, he plays Guy Lapointe, who is this French-Canadian detective, and this is back in the day, back at the height of Tim Burton making actually good movies. I really thought Johnny Depp was one of the greatest actors ever, and slowly has just descended to just doing so much garbage, and it's sort of coincided with the reveal of him just being such a shitty human being as well.
Yeah.
And it's just like, what the hell is going on? And watching this movie, you could kind of tell that there's a bit of an improvisational nature to aspects of the scene, that you can imagine that some of the stuff that Michael Parks is doing, it probably is him just like, let's see how far I can take this scene and go, and seeing what kind of reactions I can get out of Justin Long. That all makes sort of sense. And then you get Johnny Depp show up, and you feel like, did Kevin Smith be like, I didn't write anything for this, just make it up as you go? Because it is just the worst aspects of improvised comedy. Like, if you're ever at like a stand-up comedy show or an improv show and you see it go off the rails of just like, ooh, these people are just not funny, and everything that they say is just increasingly not funnier. That's what it was like watching Johnny Depp in these scenes. They were far too long. They made no sense. He had this ridiculous accent that kept coming and going. It just ground the movie to a halt where I was like, no, seriously, I want to go back to the gross surgery stuff rather than listen to Johnny Depp for another second more.
Yeah, I'm torn on it because it's like, I think if it was just that scene when they're in the fast food restaurant,
yeah,
I'm in. Like I could take that. I think he's like, it's just enough that it doesn't become like overboard with how like stupid the character is. And there's certain moments in it that like I do think are like funny dialogue deliveries where he does the thing where he's like, can you guys like come closer? And he just like has the other two characters get like right next to his face just to be like, I think I've been following this, you know, if it's the same guy I've been following, like whatever dialogue he says. Like, yeah, there's parts in that scene that I'm like, I totally get with. And it's like everything after that. And like the only reason he's in it is Kevin Smith's daughter Harley, and then has been like, you know, best friends with Johnny Depp's daughter. They went to school together as kids, and like they've just been like best friends or whatever. And they're the two convenience store workers. Mm-hmm. So like Johnny Depp's daughter was already in the movie, and like that's I guess originally Smith went to Tarantino to play that role, and I forget, Tarantino was either like busy or was just like, yeah, I'm like in like director mode. I'm not in like actor mode, like whatever. And so like I guess the next person he went to was like Johnny Depp about it. Johnny Depp was like, yeah, I want to do a movie with my daughter. I'll do this. And it's just like, I think Smith has talked about like a lot of the choices for like the way he talks, like the prosthetics on his face were all like Johnny Depp's ideas, and like really they don't work at all, and it does like it grinds the movie to a halt like when he pops up, where you're just this escalating building of tension of just like what the hell is going on in this house, and then it's just all of a sudden it's like weird comedy hour with Johnny Depp.
Yeah. Yeah, it really didn't work for me, and it was frustrating, especially like the second scene that he has. Like, I agree with you. The restaurant scene, I think it does have its moments because it does sort of reveal some interesting plot aspects, especially filling in the idea of that this guy Howard is a serial killer, and you sort of see that when you see the final walrus suit. That's like basically a Silence of the Lambs sort of thing, where it's a skin suit sewn together of multiple people's skinned bodies, and so you're like, oh, okay, it's nice to have a little bit more context of who this guy is. It's nice. That aspect of it does work. And then that second scene where it shows their interaction, where he's like, oh, I believe I met him one time. And even Michael Parks, I think, isn't so great in that scene where he's doing this like really lispy, high-pitched voice that he's got going on in there. Didn't work for me, but that scene is mostly Johnny Depp talking, and it's just like, what is going on here?
Yeah, that scene's a weird choice too, and I think there's like there's like two reasons it kind of made it into the final film is that it's Johnny Depp and Michael Parks kind of going back and forth, despite Johnny Depp kind of overtaking most of the scene. But there was like a thing where I guess like for whatever reason Michael Parks decided like that the weird way he was going to talk. And Kevin Smith was just like, hey, he's like, why did you make that choice? And he's like, oh, like I'm pretending. He's like, I'm doing this impersonation of somebody that like used to have a hair lip. And Kevin Smith was like, yeah, I know. He's like, my dad had a hair lip, and it was like there's this whole thing about like Kevin Smith's dad was like one of the first like handful of people that had this like experimental surgery thing to like fix like being born with like a hair lip. And like I think a cleft palate too. And he was like, you sound exactly like my dad. It's so weird. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons it stays in the movie and is like runs as long as it is. But it's like, it's a very weird scene. And it's like, doesn't really add anything to the plot of the movie other than kind of, I guess, explaining the brown recluse stuff Michael Parks has earlier.
Yeah.
But hey, I fully agree that like you could have easily cut like Johnny Depp should have been like as opposed to being like a detective, he should have just been like a guy that has like history with Howard or something in the past that like knows what's going on. That could have just been like, the excuse to have the sort of like exposition and dialogue dump that explains what's kind of going on, and then he just like disappears for the rest of the movie.
Yeah, I agree. Giving the information that they need to help find him later on. Maybe he was like a guy who was kidnapped by Howard and escaped, and so he's the only person that's ever survived him or something like that, and he has some nugget of information that leads his girlfriend and podcast partner on their way to find them or something like that.
Yeah. Like it is the one thing that I think sort of offsets the tone of the rest of the movie. Cause in the podcast episode, when they're like I guess the one thing we didn't say about like, it's based on a podcast, and the thing from the podcast is they found this like, it was a site called Gumtree, which I think is like the UK's like Craigslist, where somebody had put up a thing that was like, hey, this is it was an ad for a free place to live, but the only catch is like for an hour a day, you have to dress up as a walrus and you can't use any words. You have to make walrus sounds, and like he'll throw fish at you or whatever. And it turned out it was like a hoax. But like they found this ad and like spun off into like this whole thing that like eventually just became the movie. I forget where I was going. I just lost my train of thought in the podcast thing. I forget how we got there.
Either way, yeah, it just sort of, it's frustrating because for me, you've got this very interesting body horror comedy thing going on that like is, for me, I'd probably call it like a 4 out of 5 movie. And then as soon as you introduce the Depp character, it becomes like a 1 out of 5.
Yeah. So that just triggered like whatever I was going in the podcast episode, like as they're pitching the movie. You were never going to leave Howard's house once Wallace got there. It was just going to be the two of them. And like, I think you could have easily made that movie and still used like Haley, Joel Osment, and Genesis Rodriguez as like a, them just, to cut away periodically and have it still work and just cut out the entire like Johnny Depp storyline.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
keep the like creepy tone like escalating as they're trying to find, their friend that's getting his tibias turned into walrus tusks.
Yeah. And then I think I as a Canadian, I need to sort of chime in at some of the
This is what
jokes.
I wanted to ask about. How you felt as a Canadian, like watching some of it.
Well, you know what? Like, some of it, we're all self-deprecating up here, so like we can take the jokes and things like that. That's no problem. It's the ridiculousness of like Johnny Depp being like, "I want a double," and that's 8 creams and 8 sugars and a splash of cream. It's like, what? A double is very specifically 2 cream and 2 sugar in your coffee. Like, you can't say a double is 8 sugars and a splash of cream. That makes no sense.
His line of saying every time he gets into a car, he has to have one of those. I'm like, what?
Yeah. Like that's clearly he thought of a funny line in his head. He's like, "Oh man, this one's gonna kill the audience."
I just like I like when Ralph Garman does the Canadian accent because it's so like he's very good with like impressions. Like he does a great like Adam West impression, and he's like. I like when he does like an accent, but it's so like over the top that it's like and like so goofy like it is here, where he's just like he does the very typical like a boot kind of like Canadian accent from like sitcoms, which works and I think is like a perfectly like funny moment. And then you swing all the way back over to Johnny Depp where he's doing like the French Canadian in like the worst possible way.
Yeah. Like, it worked when you had Harley Morenstein, who most people know from Epic Mealtime at the very beginning as the border agent.
Where I thought that was never blue.
Yeah, like those jokes I thought were pretty funny because it's sort of like you get the Canadian stereotypes, you get the American version of the Canadian stereotypes, and it kind of flips it on its head a little bit. And so I had a good chuckle at the stuff that he was saying, where it's like, so I'm trying to remember the exact thing where he's just like, yeah, we apologize, but we don't back down or something like that. And so I thought that sort of stuff, I'm like, that's actually kind of clever. And I actually kind of appreciate it there. And the whole Winnipeg connection that it takes place in Winnipeg and just outside Winnipeg in a town called Bifrost. But Winnipeg is the Slurpee capital of the world. I don't know if you know this. So it made sense that he had that like goofy, oversized convenience store drink because that's something in Winnipeg they do drink a lot. Even in the winter, they're always drinking Slurpees. So I thought those little touches were sort of interesting and funny. And like, I don't care if you make fun of Canada. We've got more than enough shit to make fun of us about. Like, go ahead. It's just you have to have, your jokes have to have a reason behind them to make sense. And like the stupid stuff that Johnny Depp was doing, I'm like, it's not funny. Like, I get it. I get what you're doing, but it's just, you're not making me laugh still. Where's the humor in it? So yeah, so that's my thing.
I think the only joke that's in that vein with his that lands for me is when they're getting ready to like storm Howard's house and he's handing them the guns and Genesis and Haley are just like, I don't want them. And he's like, what kind of Americans are turning down guns? Like, I think that's the most like sort of a Canadian joke with his that like really lands.
Yeah, I agree. Where you understand where that's coming from, so that joke makes sense. And like, I don't know. I feel like maybe the better things about Johnny Depp's character were probably either ideas or actually things written by Kevin Smith, because I can sort of sense that the more ridiculous stuff was Johnny Depp stuff. I know he loves big goofy mustaches and things like that, so that the prosthetic work makes sense if that's what he wants.
Yeah, it's interesting because like the Yoga Hosers is the like, you know, follows this, and like the basis of that movie is you follow their daughters, like the two convenience store clerks, that goes into this whole like completely like ridiculous storyline. But that movie, like Johnny Depp comes back as Guy Lapointe in that movie, but it works a lot better because the tone of that movie is entirely goofy. It's not like it's not all of a sudden just this like hard stop of like this tension and creepiness building to just now it's Johnny Depp comedy hour.
Yeah, I agree. I think the last thing I kind of want to touch on before we get to our games portion is what are your thoughts on the climax of this movie featuring the song Tusk by Fleetwood Mac?
It's perfect for me because that is... that the song Tusk is already like one of my favorite songs, and the way it's used in the movie, like of this just absolutely like insane idea for the climax of this movie of all of a sudden Michael Parks is now in a bigger walrus suit and is like, you know, forcing Justin Long in this walrus suit to fight each other where they're just bouncing into each other and like as like walruses do. And it's like Fleetwood Mac's Tusk playing, where it's like so on the nose, but like fits perfectly. And I think the way it's edited is really smart too, where you have like, you know, they're fighting, and all of a sudden like Michael Parks stands up and is like bursting out of his walrus suit as like the drum marching band drum break thing happens. Like, I don't know. I really love it. Like I remember the first time I watched it, it was a moment where like one of the moments that I like bursted out laughing because it's so absurd and like the song works so well with just the complete insanity you're seeing on screen. I think so. I think some of the shots that are edited in of like Haley and Genesis kind of storming the house or whatever don't totally work in the edit, but I think all of the stuff with the walrus fight and the song work really well together.
Yeah, it's one of those like just perfect moments where it's so on the nose, and when the music starts, I didn't realize right away that it was this song, and so when it actually does kick in, it's just one of those like audio jokes to match with the ridiculousness of two adult men knowing that they're actors in walrus costumes, banging up against each other.
It's so
to
funny.
A very serious song.
Like, it's Kevin Smith has talked about, he was like, you know, like when I was editing the movie, like I just used that song as like a placeholder because he was like, I know we were never going to get Tusk for the soundtrack. And I guess by the time it got to like the final edit where they're getting ready to do like sound mixing, like whoever was like backing the movie was like, no, they were like, we have to get the rights to this song. Like it's the only way this scene is going to work properly. And he was like, I can't remember if he's ever said how much it cost, but he was like, it was by far the biggest expense in that movie was getting the rights to that song. He was like, it cost more money than building the walrus suits did.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. You always sort of hear that with like small indie films where they're like, I need to have this song in my movie at some point, and it's like whatever X most popular band artist sort of thing.
Yeah.
Just like this is going to decimate your budget, but it has to be in there, and it really does work great because it's just like because at that point I feel like you're so invested in it. And then when this song comes on and they're having this ridiculous fight with each other, you're just like, all right, this is a silly movie.
There's also like, there's moments in the regular score too that you can like, I think Christopher Drake is the guy's name that composed it. Like there's parts especially when I think it's Justin Long like driving to Howard's house, that the score is kind of like very reminiscent of Tusk, where it's just like the wild kind of overlapping drum beats and like stuff like that. And like, I don't think I ever noticed that until watching it this time, like just refreshing to do the podcast. Like I was like, oh, like a lot of this like actual original score in this feels like very heavily influenced by that. And I just, for whatever reason, never noticed it before.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have any last things you want to say about the movie before we sort of get into the next portion of this show, or are you ready to move on?
Yeah, just two things just to point out real quick that I think are like two of my favorite moments. I love Genesis Rodriguez's performance when she does the like straight down the barrel like monologue about like being with Justin Long, knowing that he's like cheating on her and like crying, and like I don't know, I think that performance just deserves a little shout out. And then the ending of the movie with where they like, I guess if you've made it this far, spoilers, but like Justin Long's character has like killed Howard and is now just like has gone full walrus and is just living in like a zoo as like as a walrus. But there's like, they show it and like, you know, they show up with like the fish or whatever, but there's like Slurpee soda cups smashed all over the place. So he's still like having those. And it's just like this, there's a small moment that like I only noticed the last handful of times I watched it, like, you know, Genesis and Haley's character are up there. They're like, they throw him the fish and he's like eating it and he's looking at him, and like they have the like whatever little back and forth, and like Justin Long's character like cries in the suit, and one of the tears just kind of goes down one of the tusks just by like happenstance.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like a moment that I noticed, and I was like, I kind of love that this is just like accidental moment that happens that just adds to the scene of just like this weird, bizarre ending of him like living in a zoo as a walrus now.
Yeah. It's actually kind of a pretty sad ending too, because like, I don't know, at that point I'm pretty invested in the story, and just like the idea of someone deciding to remain alive while in this situation and being forced to live in a zoo, and the tragedy of all of that is, and like his ex-girlfriend and ex-podcast host who are clearly now together visiting him to throw him a fish. It's just like the most depressing thing I could think of to end this movie on.
Yeah, and then it ends with like, it just goes like straight into like Gerard Way doing like this old like a rendition of, I think, like an old like sailor song called "Oh Wally" that just like also just makes it sadder as the music starts playing. I don't know. It's just like a really good kind of downer ending for this just bizarre movie.
Yeah. And then of course it shifts in the credits to playing the clip from the original podcast episode of Kevin Smith talking about it. It's just like, all right, now we're back to where the movie started.
Yeah, it's like that podcast episode is really good because it's just like after Red State, like Smith, I think had been like, I don't know, maybe like 5 years or something like that since he'd made a movie, and was just like, oh, I'm done like making movies. Like I'm going to hit somebody at some point, but like, I think I'm done with the movie business. And you kind of hear him click in the middle of the episode of just being like, no, like, you know, trademark Kevin Smith. Like I'm fucking like, I think this could be a real movie. And he's like, I think I could make this happen. Like you hear the switch in the middle of the episode. It's just kind of interesting that like from like, I think it was like something like 6 months from like that podcast episode to the movie being completed. And like it was just kind of this like fascinating thing as somebody that like listened to his podcast at the time, like just watching that like unfold was just this really fascinating thing. And like I will say, like the thing that eventually got me to start I Hope You Suffer was like listening to Kevin Smith on these podcasts and like doing Q&As where he's just like, no, just like this kind of like world and even like movies doesn't need to be populated by people who have like he's been saying this sort of thing since like Clerks came out. Like it doesn't necessarily need to be populated by people that have the connections. Like you can find a way to like just go do this thing with your friends and like, yeah, it may not be like massively popular, but like you're still doing it. And like, it's especially podcast is a space where like people, you don't have to, like you have stories to tell, go tell your stories. And it was one of those things that like after like I'd been wanting to do a podcast for a while and I was just like, you know what? I was like, I'm gonna message Kit and see if he wants to like do this thing. I don't know what it'll be, but like we'll like piece it together or whatever. And it was like, I don't know, like I kind of credit him with like the finally being like, okay, I'm gonna like get off my ass and go like do this thing.
No, I think that's a great sort of cap to end the discussion there, because I think you really encapsulated perfectly what works about this movie and why maybe some people probably won't like it, but really, who cares? Like this is clearly meant for people who he knew would like it, and he delivered upon that. I truly believe that he delivered something that would appeal to the people that would want this type of movie.
Yeah, I'm glad that you like overall enjoyed it, because like I said, like especially like when we talked about like Katie watching it, like it's a movie that either you're with it or you're not. And like, you know, we've had the conversations that like horror movies aren't exactly your thing. And so like going into it, I was like, I kind of leaned heavily more towards you're going to be like, this is interesting, but this did not work for me. So I'm glad that you like actually, you know, enjoyed it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we are going to get into our game portion.
Don't say that you love me.
All right, so as usual, with all of these A24 retrospective episodes, we are having two games that we are going to play. The first is our double bill pairing, where the only rule is you cannot pair it with another A24 film. So Nathan, I'm going to start with you. What movie do you think is going to make a great double feature with Tusk?
Okay, so I have two, because one is a sort of obvious choice if you know the movie, and one is a outside the box pick. Because we kind of talked a little bit like that. Both of us were like, I don't know how to go with this one for like a double feature, because it kind of doesn't. It's very, very sort of singular movie, and like all of the obvious picks were just like, I don't know, like a Cronenberg body horror type thing. So my sort of obvious pick is 1993's Freaked by Alex Winter and Tom Stern, which is a very, very much inspired by MTV sort of era comedy about Alex Winter playing this actor that gets mutated by like some like toxic waste type stuff, and is just full of all of these creatures with kind of incredible special effects work. Special effects work like designs, including all done by Screaming Mad George, who also did like Society, if people are familiar with that. He did like all the special effects work for Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and like Bride of Reanimator. But it's mostly a comedy, but there's definitely some kind of like extremely bizarre moments that I think would work really well like paired up with Tusk. And if you're kind of old enough to remember like liquid television era MTV, like, and you liked that stuff, I think you would really enjoy Freaked. It's almost never in print, but there's like, you know, rips of it on YouTube if you want to watch it. And then my sort of out of the box choice is this movie from 1976 from Hong Kong called The Oily Maniac, directed by Ho Ming Hao. That is a movie about this guy that uses a magic spell to turn into a monster made of oil that is also kind of a superhero. It's I think pretty hard to find streaming anywhere, but you can find it's pretty available on like Blu-ray. If you have, especially if you have like a region-free Blu-ray player of some kind, you could definitely find like UK and like Hong Kong releases of it. But it is this extremely cool and weird movie about, like I said, like about this guy that just kind of sort of becomes a vigilante for things, where he's just like a very, very weird looking monster made out of oil that I highly recommend. Like if you just Google it and look at the creature, and it's like, I feel like you could get on the wavelength with the way that creature is with the creature from Tusk.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've heard of Freak before, but I'm not too familiar with it. I've never heard of the Oily Maniac, so I always appreciate that you come to these pretty cool recommendations for to share on the show. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I've been diving really into kind of 70s through the 90s like Hong Kong cinema this year, and that was like one of the standouts that when I was trying to find something, I was like, oh, I think this would be like a really fun, like double feature with Tusk.
Yeah. All right. Well, here I am going to be spoiling a 91-year-old movie, but if you haven't seen this movie yet, I'm sorry. My pairing is very similarly named to your first one. It is Freaks, which is a 1932 movie about a touring carnival that features sideshow attractions portrayed by people with real physical disabilities. One of the characters is Cleopatra, a trapeze artist who tries to scam a dwarf to get his large inheritance. But when her plot is revealed, the other circus workers cut her legs off, cut her tongue out, and tar and feather her to make her a living duck, where she becomes an attraction for people to gawk at, much like what happens to Wallace.
Yeah, that's a good pick too. That was one of the ones that I also was kind of like considering outside of the what I was like, okay, I gotta like get away from mostly like body horror idea because it seemed like too on the nose.
Yeah, I ended up going to this in Freaks, I guess what you would call a proto body horror movie, because it is so early in film's history, and body horror didn't really become a thing till later. But because it was pre-code, they were able to kind of get much more gross with the finale, and very depressing too. Kind of similar how I feel about the ending to Tusk, where it's just like, damn, this feels bad. Yeah.
I haven't watched Freaks in a while, and I that's the one thing I do remember. I was like, oh, this is like this does not make me feel good.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of funny that our pairings are Freaks and Freaked. So I like that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go to the next portion, which is a Would You Rather. It could be about anything related to the movie, tangentially or not, as long as it sort of makes us think for a moment about which one you would rather pick. So lay it on me. What's your Would You Rather question?
Okay, so would you rather spend a year as a human walrus, or live for 2 months where every waking moment you have to hang out with Gila Point?
Oh. Damn, okay.
I'm taking the walrus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't like either of these options here there, Nathan. Yeah, I think walrus. It depends. Is my tongue actually cut out, and are my legs actually cut off, or if after this year do I regain full bodily control?
I think after the year you regain control, but you have to pretend to be a walrus for the entire year.
Okay.
Like you don't get your arms sewn to your sides like a like a T-Rex or whatever.
Yeah. Oh man. I just because of how much I really hated that Johnny Depp character, I'm gonna go walrus.
Yeah, same.
Okay. Now, Winnipeg is not exactly the ideal location for anyone to get stranded in. During its winters, it regularly drops below negative 30 degrees Celsius, which is negative 22 Fahrenheit for Americans like you and any that might be listening.
Hard pass.
The city also has an abnormally large amount of stabbings, which is not something any city should be known for. I won't name any other Canadian cities that you wouldn't want to be stuck in, but I'm going to ask you, would you rather be stranded in Arizona or Oklahoma?
Oklahoma. Arizona is too hot. I had relatives that lived there growing up, and I remember going to visit on days it would be like 118 degrees out, and I cannot handle the heat. So I'm going to say Oklahoma. I'll take boredom over just brutal heat any day.
It's funny. I was basically just Googling worst states to live in America, and like just looking at the ones that consistently were popping up as some of the worst places to live. Obviously, people could infer other reasons why both are shitty places to live in or be stranded in. But along your rationale, I'm going to go in the same thing. I'm sure Arizona probably has some nice, exciting things to do in the desert. I don't know. I like baseball, so there's baseball out there and hockey, but the weather situation, I would not be good in that, so I'd probably choose Oklahoma too.
Yeah, there's like Arizona at least has stuff to do. I don't know enough about Oklahoma, but it seems like it's a place that probably doesn't have a lot to do. But like I'm one of those people that I hate the winter, but at least when it's cold out, you can make yourself warm. I feel like when it's just like that hot, like no matter what you do, you're just hot. And you like can't escape it. So I can't handle that. So I will take any state that is not going to make me overwhelmingly hot.
Yeah, I agree with you there. But yeah, that wraps up our show today. Nathan, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you and your work? And is there anything you want to promote?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I was looking forward to this. You can listen to I Hope You Suffer pretty much anywhere. Kind of like Dakota said at the beginning, like we cover quote unquote wonderfully terrible movies. Periodically throw like something good in there to just treat ourselves. But usually movies with titles like Nudist Colony of the Dead and Tsunami and garbage like that. So if you don't want to watch those movies and you want to hear people talk about them instead, check out I Hope You Suffer. We're pretty much anywhere. We have Patreon, all that stuff that you can find if you're interested. And then I also have a movie podcast with my partner that kind of infrequently posts episodes, but we're around, called Nate and Kate Movie Club. I think the last episode we did was Argento's Dark Glasses, where I complained about movie theater experiences being the worst now. So I was like, I feel like half the episode was just us. I've been to a movie theater twice now since COVID, and both experiences were just we went to see the new Doctor Strange, where a child spent the first hour screaming the entire time, and then the second hour they let the kid watch YouTube videos at like as loud as possible on the phone.
Oh my God.
And then we actually went to the North American premiere of Argento's new movie, where people spent the entire time like talking to the screen at the premiere, and like including a lady that every time any sort of piece of music played during the score would get up and dance. And I was just like, I can't handle this anymore. No more movie screenings for me.
It really does feel like people forgot how to behave in public after being locked inside for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think people just have got to the point where they're just like, well, it's also, I think streaming kind of didn't help either, where it's just like people are so used to being able to watch stuff in their home, and just the movies now are just a thing you want. I have in the background while you're like looking at Instagram. And so I think they just translate it over to the actual movie theater experience, and it's a bummer.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I've definitely had some very weird circumstances too. Nothing quite like that. But I actually got an email about getting a screener for Dark Glasses. I didn't respond to it. Is it a good movie? Did you like it?
It's fine. Like I think Argento's run of like his first, I don't know, 10 movies is like borderline a perfect run of movies. And then in the 90s, he starts like drastically going downhill in quality. And Dark Glasses is better than like his like post 80s output, but it's also not really good either. Like it got promoted as being like, oh, Argento's like Return to the Giallo, and it's mostly plays like an American slasher throughout most of it, which did not work for me. But there's things in it that are pretty fun, but it's like a lot of it didn't work for me. I think I gave it like a 2.5 or maybe 2 stars on Letterboxd. It's a thing that I feel like if you could watch for free, absolutely watch it. Or if you were like an Argento diehard, it's worth watching. But if you're like, it's kind of neither of those situations, then like, yeah. I'd say you could skip it.
Okay, good to know. All right, well, I'll make sure to link to all the I Hope You Suffer and the Nate and Kate Movie Club in the show notes so that people can check that out as well. But you can follow this show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at contrazoompod. And if you have seen Tusk, let us know your thoughts. Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you like listening to this show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.